On today's World Insight, Japan plans to release radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear reactor into the sea. What are the global ramifications of this discharge? And The Six is a documentary about 6 Chinese Titanic survivors. What can their experience of racism 110 years ago tell us about the plight of Asian Americans now?
So that for me is why something like this story, that there were Chinese people on Titanic whose story was never told.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. The Japanese government has decided to release treated radioactive water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant into the Pacific Ocean. The plant's operator said the capacity to store the treated liquid will run out by the fall of 2022. Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga has tried to calm the anxieties of Fukushima fishermen who fear the contaminated water will hurt their livelihood. A final decision is expected to be made on Tuesday. Is the Pacific Ocean big enough to dilute the radioactive water? What does that mean for everyone living along the Pacific Ocean, in Asia and in North America? Let's loop in our panelists. For Japan set to release Fukushima plant water into the sea, in Washington, D.C., Dr. Wu Changhua, Executive Director and Professional Association, China's Environment. In Anchorage, Rick Steiner, Professor of Marine Conservation Biologist from the University of Alaska. In Beijing, Ma Jun, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs and founder of the Blue Map app. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to start by asking, exactly what are we talking about? The treated but still radioactive water on the Fukushima plant. What exactly is the nature of this water? Professor, shall we go to you for answer first?
It's a very important issue, and I think it has not gotten the sort of international attention that it deserves. What's in the water, we understand, is about 62 or 63 radioactive nuclides from the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown. They've been using this water to cool the reactor cores that are very hot and then funneling the water into these tanks. Plus there's groundwater flowing into this area as well. So it's radioactive. There's cesium-137, very, very toxic radionuclide, tritium, the special form of that. There's carbon-14, cobalt-60, strontium-90, there's plutonium, iodine-129. There's all sorts of radionuclides that are associated with a nuclear fission power plant that are in this water. Some of it can be treated and removed, but the existing system that TEPCO and the Japanese government have used there has not worked. There are better systems that can get this water down to almost non-detectable levels of radionuclides, but they haven't chosen to use those.
Has the IAEA and other international organizations been looking at it recently and know what is exactly inside or not?
I don't know the last visit they had there, but even TEPCO, the owner of the plant, has been very non-transparent about what's in the tanks. They only finally reported that there's carbon-14 in the contaminated water in these tanks just last year. It was suspected long before, and there's all sorts of other nasty radionuclides in the water. We know that IAEA knows this as well. 1.23 million tons of this water in these 1,000 tanks. It needs to stay there for another, I'd say, decade or so until we get the water properly treated and processed.
Mr. Ma, you are an expert about water, particularly the environmental issue of water in China. Looking from afar, what do you make of the latest, the possible move from the Japanese government?
There are different options, but the Japanese government want to take the what they, in their minds, the easiest or the cheapest way, that is to dump the waste directly into the Pacific Ocean. The real problem is that all this are based on mostly the self kind of monitoring or research by the TEPCO company. But unfortunately, this company has lost its credibility and doesn't deserve the public trust. You know, from the very beginning, a whole series of human errors by this company has led to such a disastrous result. And also, you know, it even involves a covering up or, you know, at least the sharing a lot of misleading information that even got the decision makers, the leaders in Japan, furious. In quite a few occasions, it's not transparent to the neighboring countries and the countries downstream, you know, Canada, United States. I think that the problem is that this should not be a decision of the sovereignty decision, because it's going to have an impact on the largest ocean on the earth, and also affect the other countries and regions. So there's a consultation process that is necessary.
Now, Ms. Wu, there have been already countries around the Pacific protesting against the latest nature of move from the Japan side. For example, China and South Korea has responded by calling on Tokyo to consider it carefully and with transparency.
You know, there's a general sort of failure on the international or global environmental governance. Somehow this, tragedy has been left mostly in the hands of the Japanese government to handle that, Japanese companies, Japanese government to handle that. And they sort of hijacked the International Atomic Energy Agency to be with them, right? And as the voice, actually, in order to protect them, the reputation of the Japanese government there. So yes, absolutely, Chinese government, South Korean government, have been doing the right thing in terms of really calling for voicing the concerns and calling for more actions there. But it's not adequate. United States, Canada, Russia, all the other related countries at least should be joining hands and to have a broader consultation among them and figure out what the solutions should be. Governments need scientific evidence, data to support their positions, and also supporting decisions. From technology perspective, there are solutions there that need to be deployed. In terms of when to, dispose or discharge the water, scientific community has, more scientific-based solutions, that timeline, right? And rather than now, probably should be postponed to maybe, a decade after today. So all those issues need to be put on the table, and at least actually by the major related countries in that region.
Professor Steiner, it's important to understand not only about what it means to human beings, but also to the environment in the sea. What does that mean to marine life? What does that mean to the ecosystem? One of the things people talk about is tritium. Now, according to the Japanese side, it has been already met the so-called standard, but such a huge amount of radioactive water being thrown into the sea, what would that mean, short and long term? Will Japan still be a viable player in providing seafood, both for its own people and for the others around the world? What would it mean for fishing village and communities from other countries that are around the Pacific? All of these, I really need some answer.
And we have a lot of experience, a lot of understanding of that from other disasters around the world. Hydrogen bomb testing in the Pacific in the 1950s and 60s by the U.S. and then Soviets on their soil deposited a lot of carbon-14, radioactive carbon in the oceans. We have found that everywhere. It was just reported in little bugs at the bottom of the Marianas Trench 11,000 meters deep, the deepest part of the world ocean. So this stuff over decades flows with currents. It does not degrade quickly. The half-life of carbon-14, again, is 5,700 years. So that's a long period that this stuff will still be in the environment. It is absorbed into phytoplankton, and all these isotopes, most of them anyway, are absorbed into phytoplankton, then zooplankton, then fish, and then they're concentrated on up the food chain into marine mammals, the terminal predators in the ecosystem. And there have been seals, for instance, in some areas in the Irish Sea and the Barents Sea that have come up with blood cancers from nuclear waste disposal into the sea in those areas. So we know that these are really hazardous. They last a long time. And whatever is dumped off of Fukushima, we know where it's going to go. It's exactly where the radiation went before, all the way across the North Pacific Drift then the water splits. Some of it comes up to Alaska, where I am. Some of it goes down past Washington, Oregon, and California. And there was radioactive Fukushima nuclides monitored in all of these locations pretty quickly after the disaster. That's exactly what will happen with this big pulse of radioactive water. So there are, and to my esteemed colleagues on the panels, you're absolutely right. It is embarrassing to me as an American citizen and an environmental scientist that my government has not stepped up and weighed in on this issue. And the same with Canada and the same with Russia. We are all downstream of this. We are all potentially exposed by this proposed release. So these governments need to weigh in robustly with China, Korea, and Japan and come up with a more robust, environmentally rational solution. And that's at least to pause any release for 10 years, as Ms. Wu suggested, at least for 10 years. Then the tritium degrades, and we have filtration, this ion exchange system by Purolite in the United States that can filter all this stuff out. But it takes time to do it. It's expensive, but we'd much rather do that than dump all of the stuff in the North Pacific.
If geopolitics have become a factor in the final decision-making process, how sad or tragic would it be, whether to open your eyes to a potential disaster, if it is, of the environment?
I mean, one could argue that Fukushima disaster 10 years ago was an accident. It was we should have been able to envision it by the way they located the auxiliary generators down where a tsunami could take them out and then not pump the cooling water. That was poor engineering. But this would be an intentional release of radioactive contaminated water into the North Pacific that would then expose Canada, Alaska, and the west coast of the United States, and Hawaii as well. And that is morally and ethically, I think, unacceptable in the 21st century. In the 20th century, we used the oceans, the human society did, as a dumping ground. We dumped all sorts of things into the oceans. We can no longer afford to do that. And so we need these governments to set aside whatever geopolitical arguments they're having at this time between Russia and the United States and China and Japan, and come together and get a realistic solution for the future here. We can do it. The solutions are there. We just need the political will by the Japanese government to do it.
Mr. Ma, we understand it's not only other countries that are protesting, but also the fishing community within Japan as well. Will communities be able to make a big enough voice?
It's fully understandable for them, for the fishery community, to make their voice their opposition, because the Fukushima Daiichi disaster 10 years ago already have hit this community so badly. Now I think the fishery is I've seen some reports that it's only just recovered by about 20% of the original 10 years ago. And now, with this discharge, even if we don't talk about all the signs, Professor Steiner have a very clearly listed. But even if we don't talk about this impact, just the impression that this is going to give to the consumers in Japan, and then the consumers in China, in Korea, in in other parts of the world, going to be quite damaging to this community. So I really respect what the fishery communities are doing in Japan. Having said that, I visited Japan a few times, and I have the chance to get together with the local grassroots groups. It's really what they're doing is really admirable. But in the meantime, that society is also quite top down, I have to say. The government have a lot of say, and to my great surprise, companies like TEPCO actually have maybe an even greater say when it comes to how to handle this type of disaster and the disposal of such a hazardous wastewater. I mean, this should be a national decision made, but TEPCO has been basically given the power, a lot of power to decide how to handle this, and even during the crisis situation. So I think that's actually a big problem.
The other question is also important. We are talking about climate change, right? But what about, this very obvious environmental hazard? Are we, just trying to look at one issue while hiding away from all the other obvious issues?
No, I think definitely we all know climate change is a recognized biggest existential threat to humanity for this century. But in the meantime, we have many other ecological, environmental security risks that are threatening the life for not only for human beings but also for nature, for the ecosystem there as well. Interesting enough, if you look at the process of global efforts to address climate change challenges, I have to say, I think we've achieved a tremendous amount of progress already, because if you look at the largest economies, we're all leading, committed to net zero carbon neutrality around the mid of century. So now what takes actually is actions, not just talk about it, actions there. In the meantime, the international community has to spare more and more attention to other issues like what we are talking about here today. Rather than being distracted by some countries, using geopolitics tools, instruments, or tricks even, but rather look at the reality. Historically, if you look at all the radioactive, the bombs, the testing, whatever, like Professor Steiner mentioned early on, they've already impacting human life. That's human rights issue, right? Back then, maybe a few decades ago, no one was holding the major players accountable, but they're already killing people, damaging people's health. We need to talk about it, actually. So historically, we need to really dig out all those issues, facts, evidence, data, using the history as a perspective to look at what's happening today, right? And I think that offers a strong foundation for an international consultation process, at least by major countries related in the region. But more important, I think United Nations need to step in, right? And to become the leading platform for international community to come together to address issues there.
I remember very clearly when the two sides, China and the United States, with the latest strategic talk in Anchorage, Alaska, the Secretary of State from your country has been talking about this place being chosen because of its environment. It's a beautiful place and a quiet life, people nice. And how do you see the whole issue and the framing of the issue today?
I think the takeaway here is that we all live downstream of someone else upstream. And so we all have a collective responsibility for a global raising of our standards for reducing pollution and reducing overharvest of all sorts of natural resources, and for resolving climate change and all sorts of seemingly intractable environmental stressors that we're imposing on the biosphere. But yeah, Alaska would receive some of these radioactive nuclides in this released contaminated water. We received some of it from the actual disaster in 2011. Right. But the other thing that your previous question poses is the issue of climate change. We all often hear nuclear fission energy invoked as a solution to high carbon energy production systems. And here we see very clearly in Fukushima the faults of that sort of logic. It's going to take probably the rest of this century to effectively deal with the disaster at Fukushima. And even then, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars will have been spent on it. All sorts of human lives have been disrupted and all sorts of environmental damage from the initial disaster. And now if they actually release this contaminated water, additional damage. So adding all that up together, it doesn't make sense to use nuclear fission where we haven't really worked it out safely as a solution to our energy problem. So, but I hope that, as my esteemed guests, colleagues here on the show have mentioned, it is a time for the world community to step up, international scientists and governments to step up and help Japan and TEPCO, join together with finances and scientific wherewithal and technology to solve this problem. It's not just Japan's problem, it's the world's problem.
Yeah. Rick Steiner, Ma Jun, and Wu Changhua, such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your contribution. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come in the program. The Six is a documentary about 6 Chinese Titanic survivors. What can their experience of racism 110 years ago tell us about the plight of Asian Americans now? We're going to find out from the director of that documentary.
So that for me is why something like this story, that there were Chinese people on Titanic whose story was never told.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The Six is a documentary about the 6 Chinese survivors of the Titanic. It was produced by Oscar-winning director James Cameron and is scheduled for release in China later this week on the 109th anniversary of the Titanic sinking. The Six focuses on the racism the Chinese on board the Titanic faced while on the ship, on the lifeboats, and when they arrived even in New York. In 1912, the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in force in the United States, and the Chinese survivors disappeared from the pages of history until now. I got the chance to speak to Arthur Jones, the filmmaker and director of The Six, to help us understand how the traumatic experience of The Six precedes contemporary racism towards Asian Americans. Take a look. Arthur, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Years of efforts.
I think it's about 6 years now, yeah. It's funny because the last film I made took 6 years. The one before that took 7 years. And I said to myself, I'm just going to keep taking a year off each time and maybe we'll make the films quicker. And this one, we kind of finished it around 5 years. But then, of course, the cinemas were all shut down for a while. And so we only got it out after 6. So it seems like 6 years is my natural
What is it like, 1 year after the production is done, to look at it again?
It's a really good question. I mean, I watched it at the premiere last night, and I got a chance to see it on the big screen again. And it's a film, in a way, it is of course a documentary, and I'm proud of making a documentary, but it's also a film.
There were 8 Chinese passengers on Titanic, 6 of them survived. They are unique among the other passengers in the sense that they are the least welcome.
And we designed it to work in a cinema. And the sound is beautiful. And our composer is a film music composer. And we shot it in beautiful 4K. And it looks amazing on the big screen. But there were a couple of scenes last night that I remember that when we were editing, I was a little bit, I was a little bit like, not sure if we should put it in or not, and does it work? And coming back to the film a year later, the two that were, one of them I really was unsure whether we should use it, and people had questioned. The other one was a scene I always liked. But watching it last night, I could really feel, goosebumps coming up.
What are these scenes?
The two scenes I'm talking about, one of them is a scene where we get Stephen Schrankert, our lead researcher, and he was the co-creator of this project with me. We get him to do what they call a human endurance test. So we put him in a very cold swimming pool.
That's what you do to your partner,
I like
isn't
to do
it?
that. I like to see him suffer. We put him in a very cold swimming pool with a thermometer deep inside him and measure his body temperature while he sits in very cold water.
Right.
And I did it partly for the science. It's interesting to see what happens to the human body. But I also did it because I wanted Stephen to have a kind of gauge for what it would have been like to be those people in the water. Because it's really hard to imagine that experience. We can just think, oh, it would have been horrible, or it feels cold or something. But being in water that is 1 or 2 degrees
It's
for
not an
40
adjective.
minutes, yeah, it's something profoundly visceral. And if you can take an audience into that, I like to take the audience into the experience through, in this case, our researchers' body language and their facial expressions. I want the audience to feel like they're invested in the investigation, that when there's a disappointment, they feel it as well. And when we find something, it's extra special. We don't use guns and car chases. We use like dusty documents and telephone calls to another country on a different time zone, and a telephone book trying to find someone's name, or these kind of things are our guns and car chases. But you have to see it through the expression on the face of people now. So I never wanted to make a history documentary that was just about archive footage and then some sort of sonorous voice of God voiceover that tells you exactly what happened for sure. I wanted to make something that expressed uncertainty and a journey where you don't know what the end is. Because we didn't know what the end was. This project began with 2 pieces of paper, a list of passengers and a list of survivors. And through that, we knew there were 8 Chinese passengers on Titanic, and 6 of them survived. And that's all we had.
History is about editing. Nobody knows every moment for everyone throughout history. So are you confident your version of editing is closest, at least to the extent that you can, to history?
I am confident that no one has ever been closer, and that we have found out more correct information than anyone has ever found before.
Was it easy to find the correct information?
First of all, I think we should think about what correct means. I think you're always trying to move, well, you're moving closer to something that the evidence suggests is true. But getting to 100% is always going to be tough, which is why I like to tell my story through people now. Because when they have a doubt, you can see it. When they're sure, you can see it. But if you just watch a film and it tells you everything's true, then what's the point? It's already decided it. Why make a film? You might as well just read the book with the facts in.
Doubt is a beautiful part of it.
I think it's a beautiful part. But I think it's something that people certainly when we were filming in China, some people said to us, what if you got something wrong? But I think from their angle, I think that's the worst thing that could happen. That's not the worst thing that could happen. For me, the worst thing is we don't find anything. Actually, we get something wrong. I don't think we have. I think we got it right. But I always want to be honest enough to express doubt and uncertainty. And here's the document we found. Can we trust it? I don't know. Let's talk about that. Let's see where that takes us.
Because the story, when it came to you, it started from uncertainty and doubts.
I mean, that's really all it started with. If you want to talk about facts, we had 8 names, 8 ages. I'll give you an example. The names, I think 3 of them changed the spelling when they were rescued 4 days later. I think 4 of the 8 ages changed. So, they gained 4 years in 4 days or something. I mean, it's so unreliable, you don't know where to begin. The names themselves, they're written in the English, in the alphabet. It's ABCs. It's not written in Chinese. In 1912, there's no pinyin. What's the system for writing it down? Who wrote it down? Was it a British sailor on the ship as they came on? Was it a ticket official? Was somebody copying from something? Was it one of the Chinese guys just told someone all the other names? Was it one of the Chinese guys wrote it down? All of these are things that we spent months and months considering and trying to work out. You start with nothing, And then piece by piece it comes together like an incredibly complicated jigsaw that you know you can't possibly finish, but you're just trying to get as much of it done as you can.
You had 5 years of your own jigsaw, while at the same time trying to piece together their jigsaw. So what happened to these people? Many would wonder, who have not yet watched the movie.
Well, the six, in a nutshell, they were working men. They worked on boats. They worked on ships. We knew that they'd gone through the UK. That's how they'd started off their journey. And they ended up on Titanic together.
Titanic, it is a Chinese story. They were kind of shuffled off and hidden, you know, kind of expunged from records, so on.
Those stories are very well documented for almost every single one of those survivors. But the Chinese are almost uniquely unknown.
He may have been the last one that was saved. That became the inspiration for how Rose was saved.
The last person rescued from Titanic is Chinese.
Where did they go? What happened to them?
They deserve to tell their story as much as any other survivors do.
Yeah, but that immediately, you ask the question, well, just because they're Chinese and on a ship together, do they know each other? Are they friends? Are they brothers?
And why were they there?
Why were they there? And all these questions. And some of these questions you find...
And why did they start from the UK?
Why did they start from the UK? Yeah. Well, did they start from the UK? Was it just by chance? They're just on a journey. They happened to be in the UK. So all of these things are things that we answered. But how we answer the questions as we met them is very variable. Sometimes it was about individual information we had about them and what they like to do. Or
give me an example.
An example would be in 1912, they were on Titanic. 6 of them survived. They ended up being they arrived in New York. They were put by immigration officials onto a ship that they were due to work on anyway. But they were treated very differently from the other survivors who were all looked after and put up in hotels. These guys were kept on board the rescue ship overnight, written about very badly in the press, and the next day they were sort of, there were actually newspaper reports that said, essentially, don't worry, we'll get rid of them tomorrow. I mean, it was awful. I mean, when you read this and it's just, it's just unimaginable.
Did they say why? They want to get rid of
First of all, there was a lot of basic prejudice against Chinese people. So the idea that Chinese people could kind of wander free, come into New York and wander into the country was something that a lot of people, for many reasons, had issues with. Mostly political reasons why Chinese were scapegoats, why they were the ones. It was easy to kind of blame one community for a set of problems. The economy's not doing well, and some white Americans are out of work. Well, what's an easier way to explain that than not the economy's being run badly or something? But it's these guys that are taking your jobs, Get one set of poor people to blame another set of poor people is easier than getting it's less risky than getting poor people to blame the people who are running the system. And I mean, we see that again and again in the world. That's not an uncommon way of doing it. So I think they were just the scapegoats for a while. I mean, it's happened to many communities at that particular time, and in different ways right up to the present day. The Asian community, the diaspora of Chinese and other Asian communities, has been a target for these kind of things. What happened to them next is they got onto a boat. They ended up working for 2 or 3 years on that ship, and they gradually spread out as they followed their own paths. And they ended up being in the US and Canada and the UK. And we were talking about whether it's an individual detail that took them somewhere or a history reason. Because often we would lose them. We don't know where they went, or we don't know where one of them went. And then sometimes we had to go back and kind of read the wider history. Where is it likely that they would go? Because they could be anywhere, So where is it likely? So for example, we know that in 1912, why were they going to the US? They weren't going to immigrate into the US. They were going to work because in the UK in 1912, there was a coal strike. And the shipping industry was being affected. There was no fuel to run the ships. So these shipping companies would often send their workers to work on different lines so they could keep them working. So they sent these guys over to the US to work on fruit boats and cargo vessels up and down usually the east coast of the US, from New York down Baltimore and down that coast, right the way down past Florida into the Caribbean, into Cuba, and then they'd come up and down delivering fruit and things like that, working that ship. And then we would find them through shipping records. But in 1914, 2 years later, some of them started to disappear, and the number of Chinese men working on shipping began to reduce on the US coast, and you find them turning up back in Europe again. Why? Well, because the First World War has broken out. A lot of European and British sailors who worked in the merchant navy were being drafted into the navy to work in gunboats and battleships and so on. And so you still need the merchant navy to run, to get food and imports and exports. And so a lot of Chinese workers were invited to come and work on those ships. Incredibly dangerous work, because effectively you're working in war zones with torpedoes and submarines and lots of danger. Many of them died working incredibly bravely on those ships because it was work. It was an opportunity to do it. And I think some of them believed in it. It was an important thing to do. They felt they were doing the right thing. And so they did that for a few years. And then in 1918, the war ended. What happened then is that a lot of communities, especially in Britain, but in the US too, often the local union, local government would say, now what are we going to do with these guys? You know, we got all these Chinese guys living here. We got our guys that are coming home. Can we get rid of them somehow? And in the US and Canada, they had laws that they would use to protect industries and so on. We know the very famous, the Paihuafan, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was used to reduce immigration from Chinese people almost to nothing for a long time, 60 years or so. Canada had similar laws. The UK, you might look at it on the face. I mean, I'm English, You might look at it and say, oh, we didn't have those laws. But actually, we had other kind of insidious ways of keeping out communities we didn't want. Essentially, in 1912, if you were Chinese, you wouldn't even have the hope of immigrating into the UK. There was no system to do that. And when they wanted to get rid of Chinese workers, they would find other methods to get rid of them, sometimes commercial. They'd work with the shipping companies, get a whole bunch of Chinese sailors to work on a contract, taking cargo, say, back to Hong Kong or something. They'd get to Hong Kong, and then they wouldn't sign them back up again. And the Chinese guys couldn't stay in the UK without a work contract. So all sorts of ways were used to control their lives, and many of them were married to local women in the UK. There are children of those Chinese sailors, often with British wives, from that generation, whose fathers just disappeared. They never knew what happened to them.
Looking at history like this, does it make you have more hope about us? I mean, us in general?
I think it's just my character. Maybe it suits documentaries. I'm not really focused on the result. We set out 6 years ago to make this film. I didn't know what we'd find. Honestly, I had no idea. It's not like we had a script that told us where everything was going to go. So for me, it's all about process. And my process is that we make films about trying to uncover things and uncover mystery. I think what do they say? The sunlight is the best antiseptic. You expose something, you talk about it, you bring it out into the open. So that for me is why something like this story, that there were Chinese people on Titanic whose story was never told, is important to tell it. It's not just to fix the textbooks. It's because we're reinserting a national story into a global story. And that has to be important. Even if at some points it's uncomfortable, there are difficult things to say. Even now we have this very important, Stop Asian Hate movement, the Yayi, that we're talking about now in the US and the UK and all over the world. It's painful to go through that discussion, but it's the first step to reveal it and to talk about it. Because I think 20 years ago when I was first in China, I came to discover that it was a thing. There's a lot of prejudice around against people of different nations, not just against Chinese people. There's lots of prejudice around. And of course I became aware of the prejudice and discrimination against, against Asians living in different countries around the world. You know about it. You know if you are Asian, or if you live here. But a lot of other people didn't know, and they would just talk about the cliches of an Asian community. Oh, they do very well in business, or they're smart and they're hardworking, and all of these things, which are kind of
can be interpreted both ways.
Yes.
Depending on the time.
It's sort of it's a kind of it's a reverse kind of situation where it feels like it's a compliment, but there's something written into it that's not a compliment. It's uncomfortable. And so we can observe these things. But I think beginning to question those cliches, the stereotypes, the idea that, you know, that Chinese immigrants or Asian immigrants are the quiet minority, or they just get on with things, they don't make a fuss. I think those things are all worth examining and talking about. And we found a way in this film to touch on an issue that we initially thought might just be about a boat or a ship and the people on board and how did they escape and what door did they go through. But over time, the story did what I always hoped it would, which is that it began to touch on issues that still affect us on a macro level and a micro level. On a macro level, society-wide, these still affect us, and we know because we're talking about it, and it makes people uncomfortable, but we still have to talk about it. And on a micro level, because the characters in our film, including the son of Feng Long, who's the survivor we know most about, we discovered over time that there was a break in his family. There was a twist in his family that was separating him and his father, that was keeping his father has long gone, but during his lifetime, he just didn't know his father that well. And it was not just a story of a quiet man who doesn't tell his story. There were reasons, some of them very big reasons, why he in particular, but that generation of immigrants kept a lot of secrets, kept a lot of things in their hearts and didn't tell people. And so I think the chance to open that box and begin to talk about it, for me, that's a process issue. We don't quite know where it's going to go, but I think it's important to open the box and look inside and start to talk about it.
Wonderful story. And I guess for you also a wonderful journey. Congratulations once again, Arthur.
Thank you so much.
The Six.
Thank you.
That's documentary, The Six, on the story of the 6 Chinese surviving the Titanic tragedy and yet met with racism after that. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.